Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're doing really well today. And on today's video, we're going to be talking about healing and overcoming patterns of self-abandonment. If you really enjoy the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you feel as though someone needs to hear this message, by all means, share the video. And if you enjoy the content on this video and want to see more videos like this, be sure to subscribe. I'll speak to you in a sec. Kickstarting the video off, I can only really talk about my own experience with self-abandonment and ways I've overcome it. I do recommend off the bat as well, if you feel as though you feel a constant state of abandonment, even when you're around people and you can't be by yourself to this, I highly recommend working with a trained professional. That is a huge asset to have, because it reestablishes a positive connection with another human being, which for most people I would probably predict that if you've struggled with some form of massive abandonment issues, that you might have not had a positive caregiver in your life, or someone that you could relate to as an adult or someone your own age. So by having a therapist and someone like that, you can reestablish a more nurturing relationship with someone, and it builds a sense of trust that the facts are friendly, the world is a lot safer, etc. So that's off the bat. In terms of my own experience with self-abandonment, I would probably say that when this has come up in my own life, and I'm very diligent in trying to work through these issues myself, and it's an ongoing process. I feel as though it's usually stemmed from some form of trigger or some form of emotional flashback. So in comparison to a kind of normal flashback where there's a visual cue, sometimes with the emotional flashback there is just an emotional memory. So you might not have necessarily like a visual aid, and it can usually stem from, it could be some kind of visual cue or an auditory cue, someone's tone of voice, a facial expression. It could even be like an aroma or a smell, or it could be a certain location that's put you into a state of feeling highly adrenalized. You feel toxic shame, you feel this sense of worthlessness or inadequacy. You feel as though you're neurotically guilty, you're guilty for guilty's sake, you've not actually done anything, you could just be sat by yourself and have this wave of very, very strong feeling states come over you. And it can create a sense of powerlessness, it can create this sense of like, I don't belong anywhere, I don't fit in anywhere. It could create a sense of, I don't have a sense of worth to connect with other people, I don't feel valued, or something to this extent. So in terms of going from, working on it from yourself first, say that you're contemplating a therapist, but you want to do some work on yourself first in the meantime, I would be very attuned to your feeling states and be very attuned to how you're feeling on a moment-to-moment basis. Is there certain things that when you feel a sense of toxic shame, neurotic guilt, fear, chronic social anxiety, is something triggering you to go into that? So having a look at that first. So is it that when someone pulls a certain facial expression, or is it when someone has a certain tone of voice that you have this washed over feeling of shame, guilt, anxiety, confusion, whatever it is? And then being very observant to them triggers, then you can actually elicit a nurturing response towards yourself. There is a tendency, I think, with self-abandonment that what people usually do is it's very easy to esteem yourself when you're winning. You know what I mean? Like, it's very easy to esteem yourself when everything's going right and everything's flawless. But it's a different song when everything's wrong. If you had possibly caregivers who, when you made a mistake, they launched into you, and that was, you were like target practice to them. Or if, for example, when you were needy, they got very angry, or, when you were sad, they shamed your sadness. You might have picked the habit up of that when you feel bad, you have the tendency of not wanting to take care of yourself, or even possibly punish yourself if your primary caregivers did the same thing to you. So it's really being very aware of your triggers and just being aware on some level, on a moment-to-moment basis, how you're feeling. Do you have these massive surges of adrenaline for no reason? Do you have these massive feelings of toxic shame for no reason? This pervasive feeling of inadequacy and smallness and not feeling worthy, not belonging anywhere. So just being very observant of that. And then what I would do is I would write your triggers down, or just the ones for now. I know it sometimes when we get into an emotional flashback, everything becomes all of a sudden very confusing because you're adrenalized. It's all the blood's going to the working muscles. You can't really think very rationally and very logically. So it is a bit of a practice doing this. But I would write it down. Write down the triggers you know of it as it stands, and just over the next week or so, start writing things down. Put it tangible somewhere so you can see it, and then it becomes real. And then what I would do for the triggers that you do manage to self-discover, I would try and create a contingency plan of just a nurturing thought that you could give yourself in them moments, rather than getting angry at yourself for feeling angry, or getting more guilty for feeling guilty, or feeling more shame for feeling shame. Rather than exacerbate the emotion, compound it, or feel as though you need to be in a state of this like total emotional perfectionism, which is also unrealistic, I want you to just accept the emotion, but then also give yourself a nurturing response. So if you're frustrated or angry, rather than going, oh, I can't believe I feel so angry, a lot of spiritual practices often, like, they say, anger's one letter away from danger and stuff like this, and anger in and of itself is a danger hazard, and it should be forbidden. I would go under the guise of, because I don't quite agree with that. I think a lot of people suffer from a lot of depression, including myself, from suppressing anger and holding on to resentments and stuff like this. If you don't express your anger in healthy ways, it will get essentially turned against yourself, and it kind of mutates into self-hatred over time. So expressing anger in healthy ways, so it's doing it in controlled manners, possibly to assert your boundaries, and you can also externalize it. You can also journal about it. You can use profanity and swear words and whatever else in your journaling. So that way you're externalizing the issue without obviously going to some kind of volcanic rage on someone else. You can do it in a safe way. So in terms of that, what I would say is eliciting some form of nurturing response at the times where you feel the most vulnerable. Because I think a lot of us pick up this habit of, when we've been needy, if we've needed a parent to help us self-soothe, they've not been there. So then you've been taught that, when you feel like this, we're not going to help you. So there is a tendency to, however your parents treated you is how you begin to treat yourself. So when you feel ashamed, you might just dissociate, or you might just let it run wild, because there's never been an intervening parent or caregiver or some kind of adult to come in and say, it's okay, don't worry, you're doing the best you can, you don't need to feel ashamed. By doing that to yourself and just being very aware of where your triggers are, that will help possibly the triggers subside somewhat, and it will help you self-regulate, or emotionally self-regulate, which essentially is the key. It's like a lot of us haven't had that practice of taking care of ourselves because we haven't had someone take care of us. There's no one actually modelled it for us, saying, how are you feeling? Can I do anything for you? Is there anything else you need? It's very foreign for someone probably hearing this who's never done that with themselves before. But, the cool thing is you can kind of essentially, I call it compassionate self-reparenting. You can self-reparent yourself to a state of having better self-esteem, better sense of self-compassion. I will also say as well that I know sometimes it feels a little bit inauthentic doing this sometimes. And there could be a couple of reasons to doing that. It could be that you've just not practiced it long enough. You've had many years of not taking care of yourself or doing some form of cognitive work, that when you feel these very intense, very painful emotional states, that you've not been there for yourself, because that's what you learnt when you were younger. Someone else didn't do it for you and didn't model it for you. And also as well, it could, I know a lot of Pete Walker's books talk about this, that sometimes to feel a sense of genuine self-compassion, sometimes there has to be a considerable amount of grieving work that needs to be done first. Because sometimes a lot of this emotion is like blocked inside of us, whether it be sadness or whether it be anger. And it fuels certain kind of instincts for either or, for self-compassion and love for self, or instincts for self-protection. So what I mean by that is, if you notice, which these are just really common things, but I'm sure most people know this, it's just to go over it again. For example, when when you were younger, were you allowed to have your sadness? Could you grieve? Could you actually express your tears with a parent? Or was it just blocked out of you? Were you shamed immediately for it, that it was a sign of weakness? And now in your adulthood, you're carrying all this ungrieved, sadness and sorrow. And then you find it really hard now to express your tears. The toxins we release when we cry, it's profoundly healing, and it recruits the parasympathetic nervous system, so it has a relaxation response. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to express tears. It's probably the most difficult, but it's probably the most potent in terms of healing. So little tips on that. If you're finding it hard to have a genuine sense of self-compassion for yourself, really explore that side as well. Really explore grieving maybe a loss of your childhood, and see if that you can cry over it. If you can talk to a therapist about it, and see if you can elicit that emotional response. Even if it's listening to super emotional music or watching a scene from a movie, just to get them tears out. It's an emotional scene from a movie that means something to you. To try and practice getting these tears out. It's very, very difficult to do. And then the other side of that is that you might find it hard even protecting yourself, which also you could argue is another form of self-abandonment, is that when you don't feel the desire to protect yourself, or you do feel the desire to defend yourself, but you feel scared to protect yourself. And obviously, whatever you value, you protect. So it's kind of, if you can protect yourself, that is also you not abandoning yourself. Abandonment, or to abandon something, is to cease support by definition, right? So it's also, it's having that compassionate inner dialogue with ourselves at our most vulnerable feeling states, when we do feel small or afraid or guilty or shameful. But it's also a sense of, I think, having a sense of self-protection, having some kind of lines in the sand, so to speak. Because there might be a tendency that when you possibly maybe hurt as a child from a parent or someone, that there was no boundaries in place, or you didn't know how to set a boundary, or you were scared to set a boundary. So that's another way of not abandoning yourself. So it all really comes down, I think, to having this kind of ultimate self-care with yourself. And that will set the stage then to not alleviate some of the possible feelings of abandonment, but also the tendency of self-abandoning yourself. And just catching on from, in terms of feeling that sense of genuine self-protection for yourself, I know Pete Walker talks about this a lot with, particularly as it relates to anger. If you have you've held on to a lot of resentments throughout your life, or you've not known how to release them resentments, and you have a lot of stored rage and anger, then it might be difficult for you until you start expressing your anger at home in a safe environment. If it's hitting a pillow, or you're journaling about it, or you're practicing at home and you're turning the volume off yourself and just acting out, expressing your anger or rage just at home in a safe environment on your own, then until you grieve a little bit of that anger or practice angering, the instinct for self-protection is essentially dormant, and it becomes slightly, well, if not obsolete. But as you practice it, and you do as well, a lot of possibly some inner critic work, where you're actually trying to champion the inner critic, and you're trying to overcome some of the negative dialogue that you have with yourself, that can also set the stage on a cognitive level for them instincts of self-protection, because you're practicing with yourself first. It's like that's the success training of it, really. So I've thrown a lot of stuff there. I know it is quite an overwhelming topic, but I think for me, it comes down first practicing it on a cognitive level, just kind of being very mindful of when you're in a trigger or an emotional flashback, in some form of very intense feeling state. And if you notice in them states that you get angry with yourself, or you just kind of ignore it and hope it goes away, that's the opportunity to practice, compassionate self-care with yourself. And that will alleviate some of the tendencies of self-abandonment. And it is kind of almost like a spiritual practice, this. This isn't something that you just do once and then you're at this kind of like Buddha level. This is an ongoing thing. And for some people who naturally might have quite high self-esteem, if you've had like good enough parenting, or you've had very supportive a very supportive family unit or very supportive friends in combination with that, you might not have these very intense feeling states all the time, like with someone who's had a very traumatic childhood. But nevertheless, I feel as though this is just a learnable skill. It's a very teachable and learnable skill that anyone can adopt, and it just takes some practice. You're not going to get it right first time. The last closing thing I wanted to say is that if you find one of the obstacles I had come into when I started doing this was that when I started to try to be compassionate with myself cognitively, that my inner critic would then activate, and it would go into this kind of self-annihilating response cognitively, where I would say, it's okay, you're doing really well, don't worry, and my critic would be like, no, you're a piece of shit, no, that's not true, it's not true, you've done an awful job, or whatever it is. So you might need to go around the houses a little bit. So it might not be, oh, I love myself, when you start doing this kind of really compassionate inner dialogue. It might be that, it's okay that you've made a mistake. I know that your critic is angry, but at the same time, you've done your very best and you're going to do better next time. Even if the critic is having a meltdown, you are still doing your best and you are still trying to become the best person you can be. So you might need to go around the houses a little bit as well. Because to go off the bat and just say, I love myself, when it might not feel very authentic or very true, and it activates the critic, it can make things worse sometimes. Where it feels in the moment, it makes it worse. So just to be aware of that. So yeah, I'm going to wrap it up there. I hope you guys have really enjoyed that video. If you haven't already, please subscribe, like the video, share it, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye bye.